They told me my baby daughter died at birth. 6 years later, I heard her cry in a grocery store. I need to get this out somewhere because I still can't quite believe I lived through it. 6 years ago, I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. I remember almost everything about that day. I remember the delivery room. I remember being exhausted and barely able to keep my eyes open. I remember counting my son's fingers after they placed him in my arms. And I remember the doctor's face when he came back into the room without my daughter. He told me she hadn't made it. There had been complications during the delivery, he said. They had tried to save her, but she was gone. I asked to see her. He refused. He told me the baby wasn't in a condition I should see, and that it was hospital policy not to show mothers babies who had died under certain circumstances. He said seeing her would traumatize me even more than the loss itself. I was exhausted, bleeding, terrified, and completely overwhelmed. So I believed him. My husband believed him too. We were told there would be paperwork and that the hospital would arrange everything regarding her remains. We held a small funeral several weeks later. Except there was one strange thing. We never actually saw her. Every time my husband or I asked about the paperwork or the remains, there was another explanation. A delay, missing documentation, someone who was supposedly handling it. Eventually, we stopped asking questions. I think part of us was simply too broken to keep fighting. For 6 years, I raised my son as an only child while carrying a hole in my heart shaped exactly like the daughter I never got to hold. I kept her ultrasound pictures. I kept the tiny clothes we'd bought for her. I even kept the name we'd chosen. I thought I was grieving a child who was gone. I had no idea I was grieving a child who was still alive.
Then, last spring, everything changed. I was in a grocery store in another town, waiting in line at the checkout, when I heard a little girl screaming. She was throwing a tantrum because her mother wouldn't buy her a candy bar. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about her voice made me turn around. I can't explain it properly. It wasn't just that she sounded like my son. It was the pitch, the tone, the little rasp at the end of her scream. It was eerily similar to the sounds my son used to make when he was a baby. I looked at the girl, and my stomach dropped. She had the same eyes as my son, the same facial shape, and then I noticed something that almost made me drop my shopping basket. She had the exact same little cowlick at the crown of her head. My husband has it. My son has it. And now this little girl had it too. I stood there staring at a complete stranger's child, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to your mind. I went home and didn't tell my husband what I'd seen. Not for 2 weeks. I was terrified he'd think I'd finally lost it. But I couldn't let it go. I started going back to that grocery store. Not every day. Just often enough that I eventually saw the woman and her daughter again. I learned the girl's name. I noticed roughly when they usually came shopping. And eventually, I worked up the courage to speak to the mother. I pretended to make casual conversation. I asked how old her daughter was. 6? My heart stopped. I asked where she was born. The woman named the hospital. The same hospital where I had given birth. The same year. The same month. I went home and threw up. That night, I barely slept. I started digging. I searched old hospital records, names, social media profiles, anything I could find. And then I discovered something that made everything even worse. The woman was married to a nurse who had worked at the hospital around the time of my delivery. Not just at the hospital, in the maternity ward, under the same doctor who had delivered my twins. And according to what I could find, the nurse and the doctor were close. Very close. At that point, I stopped thinking I was being paranoid. I started thinking my daughter might actually be alive. I showed everything to my husband. He initially thought we were making a terrible mistake. Then he saw the pictures. He looked at them for a long time. Finally, he said something I'll never forget. That's our daughter. We didn't know what to do. Do we go to the police? Do we confront the family? Do we get proof first? We chose proof. We spoke to a lawyer and eventually arranged for a DNA test. The process was complicated, and I won't go into every detail because some of the evidence became part of the legal case. But 6 weeks later, we had the results. 99.99% probability that the little girl was my biological daughter. I stared at that number for what felt like hours. 6 years. 6 years of believing my daughter was dead. 6 years of mourning her. And she had been alive the entire time. We went to the police with the DNA results, hospital records, and everything we'd uncovered. And that's when we ran into another wall. The first officer we spoke to knew the doctor personally. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Friends knew friends. And suddenly, our report wasn't being treated like a desperate family trying to find the truth. We felt like we were being treated like a problem. Our report went nowhere. We were told there wasn't enough evidence. We were told the DNA test wasn't sufficient. We were told to stop making accusations. At one point, I genuinely wondered if we were going to lose our daughter all over again. But this time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. We hired a lawyer. We went to another precinct. We contacted the relevant medical authorities. And eventually, we spoke to a reporter who had covered hospital malpractice cases before. Once people outside that small circle started looking into what had happened, everything changed. An independent DNA test was ordered. It matched ours. My daughter was alive. And she had been living with another family for 6 years. The legal situation is still complicated, so I can't share every detail. But my daughter is now living with us. And this is where the story becomes much less satisfying than people probably expect. Because getting her back didn't magically fix everything. It broke everything open. She had a mother, a father, a bedroom, a school, friends, a routine, a life. Then, almost overnight, strangers came into her world and told her that the life she'd known wasn't the whole truth. And I became the woman she was supposed to call mom. Except I'm a stranger to her. She knows who I am. She knows the DNA proves she's my daughter. But that doesn't mean she suddenly feels like I'm her mother. I understand that. My husband understands it. We're trying not to force anything. We're in family therapy. All of us. My husband, my son, my daughter, and me. My son has struggled more than I expected. For 6 years, he believed his twin sister was dead. He grew up thinking he was an only child. Now there's a 6-year-old girl sleeping in the room next to his who is, technically, the sister he spent his entire life grieving. And sometimes I catch him looking at her like he's trying to figure out whether she's really the person he thought he'd lost. My daughter has her own struggles. She's understandably confused. She doesn't understand why the adults around her keep talking about DNA, hospitals, courts, and what happened 6 years ago. Sometimes she asks me questions I don't know how to answer. Where was I supposed to be? Why didn't you come get me? And the hardest one, why didn't you know I was alive? I don't know how to explain to a 6-year-old that I was lied to, that I was told she was dead, that I spent 6 years believing I had buried my baby. I don't know how to end this post because we're not at an ending. We're at the beginning of something that looks nothing like the life I imagined when I was pregnant with twins 6 years ago. I got my daughter back. But at the same time, I took a little girl away from the only parents she'd ever known. Whatever they did, she loved them. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. I don't regret fighting for her. I will never regret that. But nobody warned me that finding the truth doesn't automatically give you a happy ending. Sometimes the truth just gives you more problems to solve. It gives you a child who needs you but doesn't know you. It gives you a son who has to completely rewrite 6 years of memories. It gives you parents who have to explain why they were lied to. And it gives you a family that has to figure out how to become a family. So that's where I am. I spent 6 years mourning my daughter. Now I'm spending every day trying to earn the right to be her mother. And honestly, I'd rather have this impossible, painful reality than go back to believing she was dead. Edit. To everyone asking, yes, criminal charges are being pursued against the people responsible. No, I can't share more details right now because the legal process is ongoing. And to everyone asking whether I'm angry, yes, I'm furious. But more than anything, I'm grateful that I heard that little girl scream in a grocery store that day. Because if I hadn't turned around, I might have spent the rest of my life believing my daughter was dead. And she might have spent hers never knowing she had a family looking for her.